What would you do if the only shelter you could find for yourself and your sick child was a place the world had condemned as a tomb? What if the only roof available was one that everyone, from the village publican to the sneering solicitor, swore was haunted, rotten, and ready to collapse? This was the choice that faced Mary Selwood in the autumn of 1853, when she arrived in the damp, forgotten corner of Lancashire called Oakhaven, with nothing but a babe in her arms and a name on a faded slip of paper. She was offered refuge in the derelict Blackwood Manor for the mocking price of her own pride, a place left to decay for over a decade. But the truth waiting for her inside those crumbling walls, buried beneath layers of dust and neglect, was a secret that would not only save her life, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in and let us travel back to that cold, wind-swearing day. The journey had leached the last of the warmth from Mary Selwood's bones. She descended from the farmer's cart onto the muddy track that served as Oakhaven's main thoroughfare, her worn boots sinking into the mire. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke, clung to her like a shroud. In her arms, a small bundle shifted and let out a weak, fretful cough that tore at Mary's heart with practiced efficiency. Clara. Her daughter was the only thing of value she had left in the world, and the child's feverish heat was a terrifying contrast to the chill of the afternoon. The farmer, a man whose kindness had extended to a silent, jolting ride but no further, tipped his hat without meeting her eye. "This is it, miss. Oakhaven." He clucked to his horse and the cart rumbled away, leaving Mary a solitary, still figure against the bleak canvas of the village. She looked a thing of soot and sorrow, her face pale and drawn, her dark dress patched and faded. She was 22, but grief and hardship had etched lines of a much older woman around her eyes. She clutched the precious, crinkled paper in her pocket. It bore a name, her mother's, Anna Selwood, and this village. It was the only clue she had, the last desperate thread spun from a deathbed confession. Her mother had spoken of this place in a fevered whisper, of a promise made and broken long ago, before Mary was even born. Now her mother was gone, and so was Robert, her husband. The memory was a fresh, sharp wound, his face earnest and pleading as he kissed her goodbye at the docks. He was bound for America, a land of supposed fortune, and he had sworn he would send for her and the baby within the year. The year had passed, then another. No letters came, no money arrived. There was only a spreading, corrosive silence that had eaten away at her hope until nothing remained but the stark reality of abandonment. The landlord had turned her out of their small, rented room in Liverpool. Her meager savings were gone. She was destitute, disgraced, and utterly alone save for the tiny, fragile life in her arms. She had walked and begged for rides for weeks, moving toward this last, faint glimmer of a past she didn't understand, praying it held some anchor for her future. The gray stone cottages of Oakhaven watched her with blank, unwelcoming windows. It felt less like a destination than an ending. The first rain began to fall, cold and insistent. Mary pulled her thin shawl tighter around Clara, whispering pointless comforts against the child's hot forehead. She took a breath, the damp air filling her lungs, and took a step. Then another. She walked toward the center of the village, toward the faint light of the public house, the sound of her own weary footfalls, the only welcome she received. She did not know what she was looking for. A familiar face, a record in a church ledger, a charity she could appeal to. She only knew she could not stop. For Clara, she could not stop. The weight in her arms was both her burden and her only reason to keep moving. A tiny, flickering candle she had to shield against a gathering storm. The whole world had dismissed her, but here in this last desolate place, she had to find a foothold. She had to. Mary pushed open the heavy oak door of the Shepherd's Crook, the village's only inn. A blast of warm, beer-scented air and boisterous noise washed over her, a stark contrast to the desolate quiet outside. The men clustered around the fire fell silent. turning as one to stare. Their faces, ruddy in the firelight, were hard and suspicious. The innkeeper, a heavy-set man with a florid face and a stained apron, wiped the bar with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes narrowing as they took in Mary's worn appearance and the pale, sickly child in her arms. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "A room, if you please," Mary said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Just for a night or two, and perhaps some milk for my daughter." The man laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A room? With what coin, I wonder?" He gestured dismissively at her patched dress. "We've no charity here, and we'll not have sickness brought into the house." The child's coughing. His gaze was cold, final. A murmur went through the room as the men turned back to their ale, their curiosity satisfied. She was a vagrant, nothing more. Mary felt a familiar flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she choked it down. Arguing would do no good. She turned to leave, the silence of the patrons a physical weight on her back. As she reached the door, the innkeeper called out, a note of cruel amusement in his tone. "If it's a roof you're desperate for, there is one place." He pointed through the grimy window, up the hill that loomed over the village. Blackwood Manor, been empty since the old lord died. 10 years now. They say his ghost keeps watch. The debt collectors and the crown have been fighting over the scraps ever since. Another man at the bar chimed in, his words slurred. "Aye, the place is rotten to the core. Fit for rats and crows, nothing more." A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled over Mary. She had seen the house from the road, dark, jagged silhouette against the bruised sky, a monument to decay. But the innkeeper's next words sealed her fate. "It's yours for the taking," he finished with a sneer. "If you've a mind to share your bed with spiders and specters," the men chuckled. Humiliation was a hot poker in her gut, but desperation was a colder, sharper blade. She had no money. Clara's cough was worsening in the damp air. A roof, even a rotten one, was better than no roof at all. She gave a stiff, formal nod that was lost on the laughing men and stepped back out into the rain, pulling the door shut on their warmth and cruelty. The lane leading up the hill was little more than a muddy stream, flanked by skeletal hedgerows. With every step, the manor grew larger, more imposing. It was worse than she had imagined. Entire sections of the roof had collapsed, leaving gaping holes. Windows were dark, vacant eyes, many boarded over, others shattered. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the gray stone, prying it apart. It did not look like a house. It looked like a corpse. But what choice did she have? Could a house of stone and shadow be any colder than the hearts of men? And what secret was the old lord keeping? That his house should stand empty for a decade, waiting? Let us know what you would do in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. Now, as the first drops of a cold rain began to fall, Mary pushed open the gate. The gate groaned on its hinges, the sound of rusted metal a mournful protest against her intrusion. The path to the front door was choked with weeds and fallen branches, a wild, untamed sea of green and brown. As Mary navigated the treacherous ground, a sharp voice cut through the sighing of the wind. "And just what do you think you're doing?" A man stepped out from behind a colossal, overgrown yew tree, a pair of shears in his gloved hand. He was tall and severe, dressed in the dark, respectable wool of a professional man, but his face was pinched and sour. His gaze swept over Mary, lingering on her muddy boots and the pale, sleeping face of her child, and his lip curled in open contempt. "This is private property." "I was told I might find shelter here," Mary said, her voice barely a whisper against the rising wind. The man let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Shelter? Here?" He gestured with his shears at the crumbling facade. "My dear girl, this is not a shelter, it is a liability, a pile of debt, damp, and legal disputes. I am Mr. Thorne, the solicitor handling the late Lord Blackwood's affairs, or what's left of them. The estate is insolvent. The Crown will likely seize it for back taxes within the year, once the paperwork is finally sorted. This is no place for vagrants. The word hung in the air, a deliberate and calculated insult. He took a step closer, his presence looming and unpleasant. Be on your way. The village has a poorhouse, I believe. Go there. He clearly did not believe it or care. He was simply sweeping a piece of dirt from a property he considered his to manage, if not to own. He turned his back on her, resuming his pointless snipping at the overgrown hedge, a clear dismissal. Mary stood frozen, the man's scorn washing over her. She was about to turn away, to retreat back down the hill toward the very poorhouse she knew would likely separate her from Clara, when another voice, frail but clear, drifted from the lane. Pay him no mind, child. Mary turned to see a very old woman standing by the gate of a small, neat cottage that huddled near the manor's edge. She was bent with age, her face a fine web of wrinkles, but her eyes were startlingly alert. She held a basket of withered rose heads. Mr. Thorne only sees ledgers and laws. He doesn't see the heart of a place. The old woman, who introduced herself as Agnes, looked from Mary to the great, dark house. A strange, knowing look passed over her features. That house, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, weighted with the gravity of a prophecy. Chooses its own keeper, always has. It was a bizarre, cryptic statement, and Mary had no idea what to make of it. Agnes gave her a look that was not quite pity, but a deep, sorrowful understanding, then turned and shuffled back into her cottage, closing the door behind her. The encounter left Mary unsettled. Thorne's cruelty was familiar, a language she understood all too well. But the old woman's words were strange, clinging to her thoughts like cobwebs. It chooses its own keeper. What could that possibly mean? Down in the village, she could see small figures at windows, watching her progress. Their distant scrutiny felt like a physical touch, a chorus of silent judgment. They had all written her off. The solicitor had condemned her. The innkeeper had mocked her. The village watched her as a fool walking toward a ruin. In their eyes, she and the house were one and the same, abandoned, worthless, and succumbing to a slow decay. The thought, instead of defeating her, sparked a tiny, defiant ember in her chest. If the world saw her as a ruin, then perhaps she belonged in one. She turned her back on the village, on the solicitor's scorn and the old woman's riddles, and faced the manor once more. The rain was falling harder now, plastering her hair to her scalp. She hitched Clara higher on her hip and walked toward the great dark front door, her resolve hardening into a cold, grim certainty. The main entrance was impassable, the heavy oak doors barred from within and swollen tight in their frames. Mary circled the immense structure, her boots squelching in the sodden grass, searching for any point of entry. The house seemed to sigh around her, a low moan of wind through broken panes and gaping eaves. She finally found it on the north side, a small servant's door half hidden behind a curtain of ivy. The iron lock had long since rusted through, the wood around it soft with rot. Placing Clara gently on a patch of moss, Mary put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It resisted, then gave way with a splintering groan, opening into a passage of profound darkness. The air that rushed out was cold and close, thick with the scent of a decade of dust, damp stone, and the faint, unsettling sweetness of decay. For a moment she hesitated on the threshold. This felt like a trespass, not just against the law, but against the dead. But then Clara let out another weak, rattling cough, and the sound propelled Mary forward. Any shelter was better than this cold, driving rain. She stepped inside, her eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The interior was a lost world. Moonlight, filtered through a high, grimy window at the end of the hall, cut a single dusty beam through the air, illuminating a landscape of shrouded shapes. Furniture lay hidden under ghostly white dust cloths, their forms bulky and indistinct, like sleeping beasts. Cobwebs, thick as spun wool, draped from the ceilings and doorways. A fine layer of plastered dust and grit covered every surface. The silence was absolute, a heavy, pressing stillness that seemed to suck the sound from the air. It was the silence of a place that had been forgotten by the living. Mary moved cautiously down the corridor, her hand trailing against the cold, damp wall. She passed doorways that gaped into black, cavernous rooms. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. This was not a house. It was a labyrinth, a mausoleum, built for one man's memory. She found her way to what must have been the kitchen. It was a vast, stone-flagged chamber, dominated by a hearth large enough to roast an ox. A great wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface warped and stained. While still grim, it felt more grounded than the rest of the house. A place of work rather than leisure. More importantly, one corner of the ceiling seemed less damaged, the floor beneath it relatively dry. This would have to be their sanctuary. Using a broken chair leg, she scraped away the worst of the filth and debris from a section of the floor near the hearth. She ventured back outside into the twilight to gather fallen branches and dry twigs from beneath the thickest yews. Her hands were clumsy with cold, but desperation gave her strength. Back in the kitchen, she laid a small, careful fire on the great stone hearth. When the kindling finally caught, the first flicker of flame was a miracle, a tiny spark of life in the immense, dead heart of the manor. The light pushed back the shadows, painting the stone walls in warm, dancing colors. It was a pitifully small fire in such a large space, but it was a fire nonetheless. Mary settled on the floor, bundling Clara in her last clean shawl, and held her close, her back against the cold stone of the hearth. The house breathed it around them, its wooden bones creaking and settling. But for the first time in weeks, they were warm, they were dry, and they were safe from the wind and the rain. Days bled into one another, measured not by a clock, but by the slow crawl of sunlight across the dusty floor. Mary and Clara survived. They existed in a small bubble of warmth and faint light carved out of the vast emptiness of Blackwood Manor. Mary's world shrank to the fundamentals, stoking the fire, rationing the small bag of oats and dried apples she had carried with her, tending to Clara. The child's fever, thankfully, began to recede in the dry air of the kitchen, her coughs becoming less frequent. With the immediate crisis of survival abating, a cautious curiosity began to stir in Mary. She started to explore the house, moving like a ghost through its silent, shrouded rooms. She went not as an intruder, but as a reluctant custodian, driven by a need to understand the place that had become her unlikely refuge. Each room was a portrait of arrested decay. In the dining hall, a long table was set for a dinner that never happened, the silver tarnished black, the crystal cloudy with grime. In the ballroom, the parquet floor was warped and buckled, and a grand piano stood with its lid open, its keys yellowed and silent. It was in the library that she first felt it, a sense of presence, of a personality still imprinted on a place. It was the largest room she had yet entered, lined from floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them. Most were askew, their leather bindings blooming with mold, their pages swollen with damp. Dust lay over everything in a thick, uniform blanket, and yet, as she spent hours in the room, seeking the slightly drier air and the intellectual comfort of so many silent stories, she began to notice a small, persistent anomaly. Behind the enormous carved oak desk that dominated the room, one specific section of the dark wood paneling on the wall was different. At first, she couldn't place the oddity. It was a feeling more than a sight. The dust motes, dancing in the sunbeams that pierced the grimy windows, seemed to avoid that particular spot. When a stray ray of afternoon light hit it just so, the wood seemed to possess a deeper, richer sheen than the panels to its left and right. Driven by this nagging inconsistency, she ran her hand over the surface. The surrounding panels were rough, the varnish cracked and peeling. But this one section, about 3 feet square, was smooth, almost silky to the touch. It felt subtly warmer, as if holding a residual heat. She pressed against it, tapped it, searched its edges for a seam or a hinge, but found nothing. It was perfectly flush, masterfully joined. It was just a slight, inexplicable difference in the texture of the wood and the behavior of the dust. A detail so minor that only someone spending day after day in silent observation, with nothing else to occupy their mind, would ever perceive it. The house was a symphony of neglect, a testament to abandonment. Everything was succumbing to the slow, inexorable pull of time and damp. Everything, except this one small defiant patch of wall. It did not fit. It was a single clear note in a chorus of chaos, and it hummed with a quiet secret that Mary could not yet name, but could no longer ignore. The discovery of the strange panel shifted something within Mary. It gave her a purpose beyond mere survival. The house was no longer just a shell. It was a puzzle. Her days took on a new rhythm, a balance of labor and investigation. She began to work not just to live, but to reclaim. She found a bucket and a stiff brush in a scullery, and began the monumental task of scrubbing the kitchen floor. The simple, repetitive motion of the work was a balm to her frayed nerves. With each section of stone she cleared of its decade of grime, she felt she was clearing a similar darkness from her own mind. She found a stash of old rags and, with a mixture of vinegar from a forgotten pantry cask and clean rainwater, she began to wash the windows in the kitchen and the adjoining rooms. As light, clear and unfiltered, poured into the dusty spaces for the first time in years, it felt like an act of resurrection. Clara, propped in a makeshift nest of old curtains, seemed to thrive in the growing cleanliness and light. Her cheeks gained a touch of pink, her eyes grew brighter. The small, contented sounds she made were the soundtrack to Mary's labor. This physical work connected her to the house in an intimate way. Her hands learned the texture of its stone, the grain of its wood, the heft of its iron. And with every hour she spent toiling, her mind returned to the library, to the obstinately clean panel. Her work gave her the patience to observe it more closely. After scrubbing the kitchen, she turned her attention to the library itself. It seemed a foolish, impossible task, but she began with the great oak desk, the epicenter of the room's mystery. She wiped away the thick layers of dust, her rag catching on the ornate carvings. She polished the dull wood with beeswax she found in a storeroom, the scent filling the air, another small victory against the smell of decay. As she worked, she became a student of the desk, learning its every line and curve. She was no longer just a squatter. She was an archivist of this one man's forgotten space. One afternoon, as she was polishing the underside of the heavy desktop, a place no one would ever think to clean, her cloth snagged on something sharp. She pulled it away and saw a small tear in the fabric. Frowning, she ran her fingers along the rough-hewn wood beneath the desk, directly in the spot opposite the strange wall panel. Her fingertips brushed against a tiny, sharp point of metal. It was almost completely buried in the oak, nearly invisible. Prying at it with her fingernail, she managed to work it loose. It was a sliver of brass, no bigger than her pinky nail, clearly the tip of a key that had been snapped off in a lock. But there was no lock on the desk. She looked from the brass fragment in her palm to the smooth, inscrutable panel on the wall. A jolt went through her, a spark of connection. This was not a random piece of broken metal, it was a clue. The desk and the wall were speaking to each other, and she was finally beginning to understand their language. Her heart began to beat a little faster. The work of her hands had led her here to this tiny, crucial discovery. The house was beginning to yield its secrets, not to force, but to care. The broken key tip was a catalyst. It transformed Mary's patient curiosity into a focused, determined search. The desk was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a mechanism. She spent the entire next day examining it with an almost forensic intensity. She ran her hands over every inch of its carved surface, pressing on every rosette, tracing every line of inlaid wood. She emptied its drawers, finding only dried-up inkwells and yellowed stationery. The secret was more cunningly hidden. Late in the afternoon, as the light began to fail, Her hand was tracing the thick, carved pillar of the desk's right leg. In the deep shadow of a carved griffin's claw, her thumb pressed into a knot of wood that felt different from the rest. It had a slight give. She pressed harder. A soft but distinct click echoed in the silent library. Across the room, a hairline crack of black appeared in the smooth wall panel. With a gentle push, a section of the wall swung silently inward, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. A hidden study. Mary's breath caught in her throat. The air that drifted out was cool and utterly still, carrying the clean, dry scent of old paper, leather, and sealing wax. It was a pocket of time, perfectly preserved. She fetched a candle from the kitchen, its small flame trembling in her hand, and stepped across the threshold. The room was small and Spartan. A single high-backed leather chair sat before a small, elegant writing desk. The walls were lined not with books, but with maps and architectural drawings. And on the center of the desk, commanding the entire space, sat a heavy, iron-bound strongbox. There was no keyhole visible, only a complex-looking lock plate. But Mary's eyes were drawn to a small, almost invisible hole in the center of the plate, a hole clogged with something. She remembered the brass tip. It was not a key fragment. It was the key itself, designed to be broken off for ultimate security. Using the tip of a poker she'd brought from the kitchen hearth, she carefully worked at the intricate lock. After several tense minutes, there was a loud clank, and the heavy lid sprang open an inch. With trembling hands, Mary lifted the lid. The interior was lined with faded black velvet. Nestled within were neat stacks of gold sovereigns, gleaming dully in the candlelight. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen in her life. But it was what lay beneath the gold that made her heart stop. It was a packet wrapped in oilskin and sealed with a large, imposing wax seal bearing the Blackwood family crest. She broke the seal with a shaking finger. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a baptismal certificate, dated 30 years prior, for a girl named Eleanor, with the mother's name listed as Anna Selwood of Oakhaven. Mary's blood ran cold. Anna Selwood was her mother. The second document was a last will and testament, written in Lord Alistair Blackwood's own hand. The script was firm, the language clear and unequivocal. It disinherited his despised cousins and all other known relatives. It stated, with profound and moving clarity, that the entirety of his estate, Blackwood Manor, its lands, its contents, and the gold in this very box, was to pass to his sole and beloved heir, his unacknowledged daughter, Eleanor. The final line of the will struck Mary like a physical blow. To my dearest Eleanor, child of my heart and daughter of Anna Selwood, to whom I could never give my name, but to whom I give all else. Mary's mother had never spoken the name Eleanor, but Mary knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very bones, that it was her mother's true name. She was not Eleanor. She was Eleanor's daughter. By law and by blood, this house, this land, this future, it was all hers. Just as the monumental truth of her discovery began to settle, the world outside erupted in fury. A low rumble of thunder that had been threatening all day finally broke, and a violent autumn storm descended upon the valley. The wind howled around the corners of the manor like a hungry wolf, and rain began to lash against the windows with the force of thrown gravel. The old house, already so wounded, groaned under the assault. Mary quickly gathered the will, certificate, and a handful of the gold coins, securing them in the driest folds of her dress. She left the rest in the hidden study, closing the panel behind her. Her first instinct was to protect what she had found, to hoard this miraculous reversal of her fortunes. But the storm had other plans. A terrible tearing sound came from above, followed by the crash of falling slate. Water began to pour through a new hole in the roof of the great hall, cascading down the grand staircase like a waterfall. Mary rushed about, using old buckets and basins she'd found to catch the deluge, her mind racing. Amidst the roar of the wind and rain, she heard another sound, A desperate human cry from the lane outside. Peering through a newly cleaned kitchen window, she saw a terrible sight. A farmer's cart, its axle snapped, was stranded in the mud. A man and a woman were struggling to control a terrified horse, while a small child huddled under a blanket in the back of the cart. With a jolt, Mary recognized the man. It was John Carter, the kind farmer who had given her a lift to Oakhaven, though he had not known her name. Without a second's hesitation, Mary unbarred the kitchen door and ran out into the tempest. "Here," she yelled over the wind. "Bring them inside." Quickly. John Carter stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. But the urgency in her voice and the sight of the open door were enough. Together, they half-carried his wife and shivering son into the relative sanctuary of the Manor's kitchen. The boy was soaked through and burning with fever. Just then another figure appeared, a rider on a large black horse shrouded in an oilskin coat. It was Mr. Thorne, the solicitor, drawn by the commotion. He reined in his horse, his face livid with rage as he saw the light in the Manor, and the group huddled in the doorway. "Fools," he bellowed, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Have you lost your senses? This place is a death trap. It will come down on your heads. Get out of there, I say." He made to dismount to enforce his authority. But Mary stood her ground in the doorway, the wind whipping her dress around her, her small frame an unmovable obstacle. The firelight behind her cast her in silhouette, a guardian at the gate. "They are my guests," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound steel that cut through the gale. "They are safe here." Thorne stared, momentarily speechless, at this defiant transformation of the timid vagrant he had dismissed so easily. In that moment, Mary made her choice. This was not just a ruin she was squatting in. It was her home, and she would defend it, and all those who sought shelter within it. The storm raged through the night, but inside the Manor's stone heart, a small pocket of humanity held fast. Mary gave the Carter family the driest space by the hearth. She shared her meager stores of food, the last of her oats, a few precious potatoes she had found sprouting in the neglected kitchen garden, and brewed a hot drink for their sick son from dried mint leaves. She held the boy, whose name was Thomas, and sponged his forehead, her movements calm and practiced from the long night spent tending to Clara. John Carter and his wife watched her, their initial shock giving way to a quiet, profound gratitude. They saw not a desperate squatter, but a woman of immense strength and kindness, a provider of comfort in the heart of a ruin. The house, for its part, seemed to hold its breath. It groaned and shuddered, shedding slates and letting in water, but its ancient stone walls stood firm against the storm's worst fury. It sheltered them all. When dawn broke, the world was washed clean and unnervingly silent. The storm had passed. Thomas Carter's fever had broken, and he slept peacefully, wrapped in Mary's own shawl. As the first light streamed through the kitchen windows, John Carter looked at Mary, his eyes filled with an emotion she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Respect. "We would have perished out there," he said, his voice thick. "My boy, you saved him." He looked around at the water damage in the hall, the pile of fallen plaster. "This house it held, and you made it a home." He promised he would return with his brothers as soon as his cart was mended. "We're carpenters," he said. "We'll see to this roof. It's the least we can do." True to his word, John Carter returned to the village and told his story. He spoke of the solicitor's rage and the young woman's courage. He described her kindness to his son, her calm command in the face of the storm. The narrative of Oakhaven began to shift. The whispers of scorn that had followed, Mary turned into murmurs of curiosity, then of grudging admiration. The fool on the hill had become the angel of the storm. A few days later, her resolve solidified by her trial by fire, Mary walked into Oakhaven. She carried Clara on one hip and the oilskin packet in her hand. She ignored the stares of the villagers and went directly to the parish church, its stone spire a steady point in the sky. She asked for the vicar, an elderly man with kind, watery blue eyes named Mr. Ashworth. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by the scent of old paper and beeswax, she laid the baptismal certificate and Lord Alister's will upon his desk. The vicar picked up the certificate first. He studied it, his finger tracing the familiar parish seal, his brow furrowed. "Anna Selwood," he murmured, "the name a ghost from the past. I remember the talk, a long time ago. A pretty girl who worked at the Manor for a summer. The old lord was quite taken with her." He looked at Mary, then at the will. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently. When he finished, he looked up, and his expression was one of pure astonishment. He cross-referenced the names and dates in his heavy parish ledgers. It was all there. It was all true. Without another word, he stood. "Come with me, Mrs. Selwood." He led her from the church across the village green to the offices of Thorne and Son, solicitors. Mr. Thorne was at his desk. He looked up, his face souring as he saw Mary. "What is this?" "I told you to leave," he began. But the vicar cut him off, placing the will firmly on the desk before him. "You will want to read this, Elias," Mr. Ashworth said, his voice quiet but firm. Thorne scoffed, picking up the document with disdain. He began to read. Mary watched as the color drained from his face. His legal eye, trained to see flaws and loopholes, found none. The will was ironclad, witnessed, and clear in its intent. His contemptuous sneer slowly dissolved into a mask of stunned disbelief. The insolvent ruin, the pile of debt he was so eager to see condemned, was in fact the seat of a vast, unencumbered inheritance, and its owner was the very woman he had called a vagrant and tried to cast out into the storm. He looked from the will to Mary, his mouth opening and closing silently. He had been humbled, not by an argument or a threat, but by the quiet, irrefutable weight of the truth, held in the steady hands of the woman he had so utterly misjudged. The seasons turned. The harsh winds of autumn gave way to the quiet sleep of winter, and then to the gentle awakening of spring. News of Mary's inheritance spread like wildfire, first through Oakhaven, then through the surrounding countryside. The story became a local legend. The abandoned woman, the ruined manor, the hidden will. Outsiders began to arrive, not with scorn but with deference. Tenant farmers came to pay their respects and their long-overdue rents to the new lady of the manor. Merchants from the nearby town of Kirkbeat Lonsdale came to offer their services. Blackwood Manor, once a symbol of decay, was now a hub of activity and hope. John Carter and his brothers, true to their word, spent weeks repairing the roof, their hammers echoing a rhythm of renewal across the valley. The villagers, whose chorus of mockery had once been so loud, now offered help. The women brought seedlings for a kitchen garden. The men helped clear the overgrown paths. They no longer saw a fool on a hill, but a woman who had seen value where they had seen only ruin, and in doing so, had revived not just a house but the fortunes of their community. Mr. Thorne, for his part, became a model of professional diligence. He managed the legal transfer of the estate with a quiet, chastened efficiency. His communications with Mary always meticulously respectful. The loud, contemptuous man was gone, replaced by a quiet, humbled solicitor who had learned a sharp lesson about judging a book or a person by its cover. Mary, in turn, treated him with a cool, formal grace, never once mentioning his past cruelty. Her silence on the matter was a more profound statement than any rebuke could have been. She was not a woman who dealt in vengeance. She dealt in restoration. With the funds from the strongbox and the income from the estate lands, she began the slow, careful process of breathing life back into the manor. She hired local craftsmen to replace the broken windows, plaster the walls, and sand the warped floors. She did not seek to turn it into a palace, but to make it a warm, sturdy, welcoming home. She worked alongside the laborers, her hands never idle, her presence a constant, quiet force of will. One soft spring evening, as the golden hour light spilled across the newly greened valley, Mary stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. Below, John Carter's wife was helping her plant rows of peas and beans, their easy chatter a pleasant sound in the quiet air. Clara, now a healthy, thriving toddler with her grandfather's dark eyes, sat in a woven basket on the grass, batting at a dandelion puff. The house stood behind her, no longer a skeleton but a warm, living thing, its new window panes catching the last of the sun like sheets of gold. The vicar, Mr. Ashworth, walked up the path to join her. He looked at the transformation around them, the mended roof, the clear paths, the smoke curling from the chimneys. "It is a miracle. What you have done here, Mrs. Selwood," he said gently. "You have restored more than just a house." Mary looked down at her hands, the nails still rimmed with soil from the garden. She looked at her sleeping child, safe and content. She looked at the warm light embracing the old stone walls of her home. "I didn't find an inheritance," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the entire weight of her journey. "I found a place to belong. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. It's a powerful reminder that true inheritance isn't what is left to us, but what we build with our own two hands." If you were moved by Mary's story of quiet triumph, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history and hard-won hope. We'll see you next time with another story waiting to be discovered.